The wind howled through the Colorado mountains like a wounded animal, throwing snow against the cabin walls until they groaned in protest. Inside, Margaret Sullivan sat close to the dying fire, her thin shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. The last bit of cornmeal had been gone for days, and her stomach had long stopped complaining. Hunger had become her shadow. She had once been someone of importance back in Chicago. They had called her the Angel of Mercy Hospital. She was the nurse everyone trusted, the one with steady hands and a calm voice that could pull men back from death's door. But one mistake, one night, had destroyed it all. A young boy named Timothy Morrison had died under her care. His family was powerful and needed someone to blame. They didn't care that the boy had taken his own medicines that clashed with treatment, or that 3 doctors had missed what she'd caught too late. They called her negligent, ruined her name, and made sure no hospital would ever hire her again. That had been months ago. Now she lived alone in a small cabin high in the Colorado wilderness, where no one knew her shame. But winter had come early, cruel and sharp. Her firewood was almost gone, her traps were empty, and her body had grown weak. If she didn't find food or fuel soon, she'd freeze before the week was out. Margaret rose slowly from her chair, her joints stiff with cold. She wrapped strips of cloth around her worn-out boots and stepped into the storm. The wind hit her like a wall. Snow swirled so thick that she could barely see her own hands. Each step toward the woodpile felt like a battle. As she bent to gather a few sticks, the storm shifted for a heartbeat, and through the blur of white she saw something, a dark shape lying motionless in the snow. Her heart jumped. For a moment, she thought her starving mind was seeing ghosts, but then she saw the horse. A bay stallion, reins tangled in a tree branch, nostrils steaming, eyes wild with fear. Margaret dropped her firewood and stumbled toward the figure. It was a man, face down in the snow. His coat was torn and soaked with blood. She knelt beside him, hands trembling, searching for a pulse. It was there. Faint, but alive. "Dear God," she whispered. Her healer's instinct took over. She rolled him onto his back with great effort. He was tall, broad-shouldered, built like a man used to hard work. Blood had frozen in a dark trail down his neck from a wound near his temple, but it was the hole high on his right chest that made her breath catch. A gunshot. Fresh. She looked at his face. Even unconscious, he looked strong. A proud jaw. Dark hair. He was no outlaw by the look of him. His clothes were fine, his boots expensive. Maybe a rancher. Maybe someone with money. But none of that mattered now. He would die if she didn't act. Margaret's mind raced. She had no medicine, no proper instruments, not even enough food to keep herself alive. But she couldn't walk away. She was a nurse, and a nurse saved lives. It was the one thing left that still made her who she was. She turned to the horse, speaking softly. "Easy, boy. Easy now. I need your help." The stallion stood still, exhausted. With the last of her strength, she managed to haul the wounded man over the saddle, then led the horse through the snow toward her cabin. It took nearly an hour. 3 times she fell. 3 times she forced herself up again. By the time they reached the door, she could barely breathe. Inside, she pulled him down onto the floor, shutting out the storm. His lips were blue from the cold, his chest barely rising. She had no time to rest. Her hands moved on their own, building the fire, boiling snow for water, fetching the bottle of whiskey she had saved for emergencies. The bullet had to come out. She cut away his blood-soaked shirt with a kitchen knife. The wound was deep, but not fatal. Not yet. She cleaned it with the whiskey, her hands steady though her body shook from exhaustion. The man moaned, his eyes flickering open for a brief moment. "Please," she whispered. "I'm trying to help you." He didn't seem to understand, but his grip on her wrist loosened, and he slipped back into darkness. Margaret heated her knife in the fire, then let it cool just enough to touch. With no painkillers, no tools, but her determination, she began the terrible work of removing the bullet. He jerked once, a strangled sound leaving his throat, but he didn't wake. Margaret kept working, whispering prayers as she searched for the piece of metal. When her blade finally scraped against lead, she let out a breath of relief. Carefully, she pried it free and packed the wound with whiskey-soaked cloth before sewing it shut with silk thread from her sewing kit. When she was done, she cleaned his head wound, bandaged it, and covered him with every blanket she owned. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she sat back against the wall, staring at the man who now lay breathing steadily in her small cabin. She didn't even know his name, but she had saved him, at least for now. By morning, the fever began. His skin burned hot as fire, his body twisting with delirium. Margaret worked tirelessly through the long day and night, cooling his forehead with snow-soaked cloths, giving him tiny sips of willow bark tea, and whispering soft words to keep him anchored. At one point, his eyes opened, cloudy with fever. "Catherine Water," he muttered weakly. "You're safe," Margaret told him. "Rest now." "Angel," he whispered before slipping back into sleep. Margaret smiled faintly despite her exhaustion. She wasn't an angel, not anymore. Just a broken woman, fighting to keep a stranger alive in the middle of a storm. But as the firelight flickered across his face, she felt something she hadn't felt in months. Purpose. Hope. The faint heartbeat of a reason to keep living. Because maybe, just maybe, saving him would save her too. Morning light crept through the cracks in the cabin walls, falling across the man's face. His fever had calmed slightly, though his skin was still flushed. Margaret sat beside him, head resting against the wall, half asleep. When the sound of movement reached her ears, she lifted her head sharply. He was awake. The man's gray eyes blinked slowly, confusion clouding them as he tried to make sense of where he was. He moved a little and gasped when pain flared through his chest. "Easy," Margaret said softly, rising to help him. "You've been shot. The bullet's out, but you're still weak." He studied her for a moment. "Who are you?" His voice was rough, dry as dust. "Margaret Sullivan," she replied, holding a cup to his lips. "And you, sir, owe your life to a blizzard and a stubborn woman." A faint smile ghosted across his face before fading. "Jackson Mitchell," he said after drinking. "Double M Ranch, South Valley." Margaret nodded. "You were lucky I found you." "Doesn't feel like luck," he muttered, wincing as he shifted. "Feels like I got trampled by my own horse." Despite herself, Margaret smiled. "That horse saved you as much as I did." For a long moment, the two of them simply stared at each other. Jackson's gaze was steady, curious, grateful. Margaret felt a strange warmth rise in her chest and quickly turned to check the fire. "You're a nurse," he said finally. "I was," she answered quietly. His brow furrowed. "Was?" She hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she stirred the pot of boiling water. "Chicago. There was an incident. I was blamed for something that wasn't my fault. I lost everything." Jackson watched her silently, seeing the pain behind her calm voice. "Sounds like you were the one wronged." Margaret didn't reply. The past was a wound she had learned not to touch. Later that day, she found his saddlebags. Inside were clean bandages, a small bottle of medicine, and a leather wallet filled with money, more than she had seen in months. There was also a photograph of a young woman with kind eyes. Margaret turned it over gently. "Catherine Mitchell," written in neat cursive. "Your sister?" she asked when Jackson stirred. He nodded weakly. "She runs the ranch with me. Smartest person I know." Margaret handed him the picture. "She looks kind." "She is," he said softly. "Too kind to deal with what's coming." "What do you mean?" Jackson's eyes darkened. "Harlan Doyle. Neighboring rancher. We've been fighting over water rights for 2 years. He thinks if I'm gone, he can take everything. Guess he nearly got his wish." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. "Will he come looking for you?" "Maybe. His men saw me ride into the storm. If they survived it, they'll search the mountains." "Then you need to stay hidden until you're strong enough to travel." Jackson gave a humorless laugh. "And drag you into my mess?" Quote. Margaret straightened, her voice firm. "I already am in it, Mr. Mitchell. You're my patient, and I don't abandon patients." He looked at her for a long moment, then smiled faintly. "I can see arguing with you's a waste of breath." "Correct," she said, hiding her own smile. Over the next 2 days, she nursed him with quiet determination. His strength began to return, though every movement still brought pain. She cooked what little food they had left, some jerky from his saddlebag and melted snow, and forced him to eat small portions. On the third morning, as she changed his bandages, he studied her face. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" he asked softly. Margaret froze. "What makes you say that?" "Because I know that look. The one people wear when they've been broken but refuse to stay down." Quote. She said nothing, focusing on the stitches, but he continued. "You saved me when you had every reason not to. You used the last of your strength, your supplies, everything, for a stranger. That tells me all I need to know about the kind of person you are." Margaret's throat tightened. "Please don't make me into something noble." "I just did what anyone would." Jackson shook his head slowly. "No, Miss Sullivan. Not everyone would have risked their life for a bleeding man in a blizzard." She turned away, pretending to tend the fire. "You need rest." "I need to thank you," he said quietly, "and when I'm back on my feet, I intend to." Margaret didn't answer, but her heart beat faster. She wasn't used to gratitude. Not after Chicago, where she'd been treated like dirt. That night, as the wind outside softened to a whisper, Jackson woke suddenly, sweating and gasping. Margaret was beside him in an instant. "Harlan's men," he panted. "They'll come for me." "They'll find nothing here but snow," she said gently. "Rest." His hand shot out, gripping hers. "You shouldn't be alone, Margaret. When I'm well enough, you'll come back with me to the Double M. You'll be safe there." "I don't need," she started, but he cut her off. "Yes, you do. No one should face this world alone." Margaret looked down at his hand holding hers, warm, steady, alive. After months of loneliness, that simple touch made her eyes burn. "I'll think about it," she whispered. Over the next day, she could feel the storm building again outside. The air turned sharp, and the horses grew restless. As she brought in the last of the firewood, she thought she heard something faint in the distance. The low neigh of a horse, muffled voices carried on the wind. Her heart began to pound. She went inside. "Jackson," she said, voice tight, "I think someone's out there." He pushed himself up, grimacing from the pain. "Doyle's men." "We have to hide you," she said quickly. "I'm not leaving you alone. You're not in any shape to fight." Their eyes met. Neither wanted to admit the truth, that they might not survive what was coming. Margaret took his revolver from the table and pressed it into his hand. "If anything happens to me, stay hidden. Promise me." He nodded slowly. "Be careful, Margaret." The knock came moments later. 3 hard raps that made the small cabin shake. Margaret drew a deep breath, her heart hammering, and opened the door. 3 men stood outside, their faces cold and cruel. "Evenin', ma'am," the leader drawled. "We're lookin' for a man, big fella, dark hair, ridin' a bay horse. You seen him?" Margaret swallowed, forcing her voice to stay calm. "No, sir. Haven't seen anyone in days." The man's pale eyes narrowed. "That so? Mind if we come in and take a look?" Margaret's hand tightened on the doorframe. "You're not welcome here." His smile was slow and dangerous. "Lady, we weren't askin'." And as he shoved the door open, Margaret realized the storm outside wasn't half as deadly as the one that had just stepped into her cabin. "Wait, before we move on, what do you think about the story so far? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm really curious to know." The cabin filled with the smell of sweat, gun oil, and danger. Margaret stood frozen as the 3 armed men stepped inside. The leader, a tall man with a thin mustache and pale eyes, tipped his hat mockingly. "Name's Watson," he said. "We're lookin' for Jackson Mitchell. Heard he rode this way bleedin' and near dead. You sure you ain't seen him?" Margaret's heart pounded, but her voice stayed calm. "I've been alone all winter. You can look outside. No one here but me and my horse." Watson's grin was sharp. "We'll just make sure of that." He nodded to his men. "Search the place." One of them, a thick-shouldered brute with scarred hands, started tossing things around, knocking over her meager supplies. The other went out back to check the lean-to. Margaret's eyes darted to the floorboards near the stove, the hidden trapdoor to the old root cellar. Jackson was down there, crouched in the cold darkness, waiting. She had to keep their attention on her. Watson leaned closer, his breath sour. "Funny thing," he said. "We found blood near the trail." Man-sized tracks. Horse tracks, too. Yours, maybe? I cut my hand splitting wood, she said, forcing her voice steady. He grabbed her wrist, inspecting it. The small cuts from chores were hardly enough to explain the bloody rags they'd found. This, he sneered, barely a scratch. Let go, she said, trying to pull back. He didn't. His hand slid up her arm, cruel and possessive. You're a tough one, he drawled, but you'd best tell me what I want to know before my friend here loses patience. The brute Briggs cracked his knuckles and gave a slow grin. Boss, she's lying. Let me make her talk. Fear flashed through Margaret, but it was quickly buried under something harder. She met Watson's eyes, chin lifted. Do what you want. I've got nothing to tell you. Watson's grin faded. That's a shame, ma'am. The sound that followed was thunder inside the small room, a gunshot that shattered the air. Briggs jerked back, clutching his shoulder. Watson spun around, eyes wide. In the doorway stood Jackson Mitchell, pale and unsteady, but alive, a Colt revolver steady in his hand. Step away from the lady, he said, voiced like cold iron. Mitchell, Watson spat. You should be dead. Jackson's second shot knocked Watson's pistol clean out of his hand. I'm not, he said evenly, and neither is she. You got two choices. Leave, or I'll finish what you started. The third man lunged for his weapon, but Margaret grabbed the fireplace poker and swung with all her strength. It connected with his knee, dropping him to the floor howling. Stay down, she warned. Watson glared at Jackson, hatred burning in his eyes. You won't last the week. Doyle's men'll burn you out. Maybe, Jackson said, but not tonight. He motioned toward the door with his gun. Get your friends, get on your horses, and ride. You tell Doyle I'm alive. Tell him if he comes for me again, I'll come for him. Watson hesitated, then spat blood into the snow outside. This ain't over. No, Jackson replied quietly. It's just started. When they were gone, the gun slipped from his hand. He swayed and nearly fell. Margaret was there instantly, catching him. Foolish man, she whispered fiercely. You've torn your stitches open. Couldn't let them hurt you, he murmured, half-conscious. You nearly killed yourself. He smiled weakly. Worth it. Margaret's throat tightened as she lowered him back to the bed. She cleaned his reopened wound, tears mixing with the blood she wiped away. We can't stay here, she said softly. They'll come back with more. Then we leave, he whispered. Tonight. The storm outside had returned by the time she strapped what few supplies they had to his horse. She made a rough sled from pine branches to carry him, though he grumbled about it the whole time. This is humiliating, he muttered. Better humiliated than dead, she replied firmly. They moved through the snow under a black sky. The wind howled again, but Margaret kept walking, one step after another, the horse pulling Jackson behind her. Hours later, they found an old cave cut into the mountainside. Inside, she built a small fire and checked his wound. The bleeding had slowed, but fever was returning. She sat beside him, brushing damp hair from his forehead. Talk to me, he said weakly. Keep me awake. What about? Anything. Tell me about before. She smiled faintly. Before the disgrace? Before all of it. Margaret hesitated, then said, I once had a little patient, a girl named Emma. 7 years old. Broke her leg so bad the doctor said she'd never walk again. I didn't believe that. I worked with her every day for months. She walked out of that hospital 6 months later, laughing like a bird. Jackson smiled through the pain. Sounds like you. How so? Too stubborn to quit. Her eyes softened. You talk too much for a dying man. Not dying, he said quietly. Not while you're here. She looked away quickly, fighting tears. Sleep. But he didn't. His hand found hers. Margaret, he whispered. If something happens to me? Don't, she said sharply. You'll live. I mean it. If I don't make it, go to the Double M. Find my sister Catherine. She'll see you're safe. I'm not letting you die, Jackson Mitchell, she said fiercely. You hear me? I've lost too much already. Their eyes met, and in that fragile silence something passed between them, something unspoken but powerful. The fever broke before dawn. When he woke, she was asleep beside him, her hand still holding his. Outside, the world was pure white, the storm finally over. By noon, they reached the Double M Ranch. But what they found made Margaret's heart sink. The place was too quiet. No ranch hands in sight, no smoke from the chimneys. Catherine Mitchell appeared on the porch, rifle in hand. When she saw her brother, her face lit with disbelief and joy. "Jackson, you're alive!" He smiled weakly, mostly. She ran to him, helping Margaret lift him down from the horse. "Who's this?" Quote, "The woman who saved me," he said simply. "Margaret Sullivan." Catherine took one look at her and nodded. "Then I owe you more than I can say." But the joy was short-lived. Catherine's face darkened. "Doyle's men came 2 days ago with Judge Blackwood. Said you were dead. Claimed the water rights were theirs now." "Not anymore," Jackson said grimly. "Get me inside, we're gonna fix this." Inside, they found the old papers, the original water right deeds their father had hidden, proof that the land belonged to the Mitchells by law. With Margaret's help, Catherine sent word to the federal marshal. When Doyle arrived again, he found Jackson alive, standing tall beside Margaret. She faced the outlaw fearlessly, holding the papers that proved their claim. "You've stolen enough lives and land, Mr. Doyle," she said firmly. "It ends here." The marshal arrived within hours. Doyle was arrested for fraud and attempted murder. His empire crumbled. Justice had come at last. Weeks later, the ranch was safe, and the valley had united. Margaret stayed, running a small clinic for the ranchers. Jackson's strength returned, and the bond between them grew into something neither could deny. One bright spring morning, Jackson took her hand by the stream that fed the ranch. "Margaret," he said, his voice soft, "you saved my life. You saved this ranch. You saved me. Would you let me spend the rest of my life proving I'm worthy of that?" Quote. Tears welled in her eyes. "Are you asking me to marry you, Mr. Mitchell?" He smiled. "Yes, ma'am, I am." Margaret laughed through her tears. "Then my answer is yes." Under the wide western sky, their love, born from snow, struggle, and second chances, finally found its peace. The valley would remember them as the nurse who healed the cowboy, and the cowboy who made her his world.